Hello, class. This is the lecture that is scheduled for April 27th on Iran in the 21st century. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically Iran since the 1990s, because in 1989, the Iranians revised their constitution and made a powerful or more powerful president than they had before. And we can divide up the history of Iran since 1989 by its presidencies, and I've listed them. There's only been four, and I'll talk about them in more detail because they're very important in engaging what's going on in Iran, who is the president. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution, which is one of the more complicated constitutions that I've looked at, and to say that it is a product of the, you want to call it genius, the mind of Ayatollah Rouhallah Khomeini. Remember, he had put forward in his book on Islamic government that it's a hypothetical book. It's a very philosophical book. He was trained in the madrasas in Iran, which put a high emphasis on philosophy and legal thinking. And so the book itself is theoretical. It's very dense, but it puts forward the ideas we've mentioned earlier, I mentioned earlier in the class, that the true Islamic government has to be governed, headed by a faqih, which is a legal scholar. In Iran, they use it for very high-level legal scholars. In Arabic and in Sunni worlds, faqih is someone who knows fiqh is law, or Islamic law, or Islamic theory of law, I guess is a better. So I think the usual translation in English is jurisprudence rather than just law. So it's the theory of law rather than the actual law itself. So he says that the head of the government has to be the faqih, who will stand in for the hidden imam. So he is an absolute authority in the state. And we see that in the Constitution. The Constitution, Articles 1 and 2 first reflect, remember I said one of the influences on this whole Islamic ideology in the 20th century was an Indian Muslim, later a Pakistani Muslim named Abu Ala al-Maududi, and Maududi had coined the term sovereignty, hakimiyet, and he said the hakimiyet or sovereignty belongs only to God. And that is, I find that I can't wrap my mind around it myself. I don't quite understand what that means when you say sovereignty belongs to God. But that's what he said, and we have Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution of Iran put that out. They basically say that is in fact true, that God is above everything else. All right. Well, who knows what God wants for us? The faqih. In the absence of the imam would know intuitively, because he is the imam, he would know exactly what God wants. But we don't have the imam, so we have to have the most highly qualified person that we have in our society, and that person will stand in. Well, that's the position they give to the supreme leader. And he will govern in accordance, and they use the phrase, he will govern in accordance of the Vilayet-e Faqih. So in other words, he will be the hypothetical person that Khomeini had described in his work. This would be the embodiment. So the Constitution of Iran is a articulation, a practical articulation of what the theoretical Islamic government that Khomeini had put forward way back in the 1960s in his treatise on the Islamic government. So how do we set it up? Well, we have at the top, I have the very complicated bodies, and I'll go through them first. First, we are a republic. They call themselves a republic, although the interesting word they use is, they use jumhur. Jumhur is the Arabic word, but they also use nizam, state, organization. In Arabic, nizam generally means it's a more negative, has a negative connotation. We'll talk about that when we talk about Arab Spring. But in Persian usage, nizam is stands for government rather than hukuma, and then, which is the Arabic word for government. And then the republic is Jumhur. So in the constitution, it says that Iran is an Islamic republic. So what does that mean? Well, the republic part, the constitution of 1989 articulated much more clearly that there would be a president who would be head of state. Now, both the president and the Majlis, or the parliament, will be elected by the people. And that's the republic part. Jumhur comes from the Arabic word for masses. So the masses. So the masses will vote for the Majlis and will vote for the president. I'll come to what their powers are in a minute. But the supreme leader, he is elected by a group called the Assembly of Experts, and that is 88, very high number, 88 mujtahids, or 88 men who are deemed by their peers, their religious peers. So they're all religious scholars. They are deemed by their peers to be mujtahids, to be at the top of their class. And 88 of them are needed to elect the supreme leader, or they could, with due cause, they could remove the supreme leader. Now, the fact that you have to have so many, there are so many of them, I think that limits the ability to remove the supreme leader. But in theory, then, the supreme leader is elected by these mujtahids, these 88 mujtahids. Now, how do you get to be the 88 mujtahids? Well, you are picked by the supreme leader. The supreme leader picks the 88 people who will constitute the body under his term. So there is no term limits for the supreme leader. He's there until he dies, or he is removed by the Assembly of Experts. And so the Assembly of Experts don't meet very often, and there have only been two supreme leaders. The first was Ayatollah Khomeini himself, and then when he died, his chief person who had been with him all the time was Ali Khamenei, and Ali Khamenei is now the supreme leader and has been the supreme leader since 1989. So he's in his late 80s by now, I think. I'm not quite sure how old he is, but he's pretty elderly. So he is in charge of everything. He is in charge of, the United States. We have separation of powers. We have the judicial, we have the legislative, we have the executive. All three of those bodies, by the Constitution, are put under the direct control of the supreme leader. And the supreme leader also has direct control of the army. And I'll talk about the army in a minute. So he is the voice. Although it is a republic, there are elections. There are no elections for the supreme leader other than those 88 scholars who are picked by him. So it's a pretty stacked deck. Then we get to the parliament. And before we get to the parliament, there's another body, and that body is called the Council of Guardians, which consists of 12 people. They are all, again, religious scholars. So all these bodies that we so far have seen, basically the commander, although he's not called the head of state, but the commander, the people who pick him, and then the council below, the council then approves who can run for office. Those are all religious people. And so we can actually call Iran a theocracy. People often say that Saudi Arabia is a theocracy. I say, no, it's not, because the royal family are not clerics. I would say there's only two theocracies in the world today. One is Iran, the other is the Vatican City. Because all other governments, even if they have Sharia as their laws, you could say they're governed by Islamic law. You could say Israel is governed by Jewish law. But the president, the people who hold the power, political power, are not clerics. So I would not call the state of Israel a theocracy. I would not call Saudi Arabia a theocracy. They both are governed by religious law, but that doesn't make them a religious state. What makes a religious state a theocracy is the fact that they are governed by clergy. And that's pretty rare in human history. Like I said, in the West, we have the Vatican City, and in the Middle East, or in the Islamic world, we have the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this Council of Guardians, 12, how do they get elected? Well, 6 of them are appointed by the supreme leader. So remember, the Assembly of Experts are all appointed by the Supreme Leader. Well, I take it back. They're not, let's amend that a minute. Only people who can run for those 88 positions are people who are been approved by the Supreme Leader. They then are elected. I take it back. They are elected by popular vote. So to be on that council, you're picked by the Supreme Leader to run, and then you're voted for by the people. In terms of the parliament also is voted by the people, as is the president, but they have to be approved by the Council of Guardians. And who, I said, 6 of the Council of Guardians are appointed directly by the Supreme Leader, and the other 6 are elected by the Parliament, who in turn is only in the Parliament because the Council of Guardians said they could run for office. And this is one of the battles that I'm going to talk about, that in the various cycles for election to both president and Parliament, we see that there's a tension between the clergy on who they're going to allow to run. And again, I want to note that of the 4 people who have been presidents of Iran, 3 of the 4 are clergy. We can tell this very easily in Iran because the clergy wear turbans. And people have asked me what they notice. If you look at a picture, actually it's in color, but even if it's in black and white, you can tell that the clergy wear turbans, and they're the only people in Iran who wear turbans, and that there are 2 colors. There's black and there's white. And as I mentioned, I went on a tour of Iran in 2016, March 2016. And by the way, I went on a tour because the only way Americans can go to Iran, now they can't go at all, but the only way they could go then was to go on a officially sponsored tour. Well, not officially sponsored. It had to have minders. It was sponsored actually by the New York Times, and it had a New York Times correspondent, was the American tour guide, but there were 2 Iranian tour guides, one of whom I know for sure was secret police, just by the way he acted and his life story. What little of his life story he told us, it was clearly that he was our minder, the one to make sure that we didn't, talk to the wrong people. But anyway, get off on that. The clergy then are, you can be in the Parliament without being a clergy. I'm sorry about the turban clergy. I'm sorry, that's what I was talking about. So they asked me why do the white and the black, and the difference is the white turbans are people who are not descended from the Prophet's family. The black turbans are people who are claim descent from the Prophet's family. So, and there's a lot of them. Because that lineage could come from a mother as well as from a father. And so you see an awful lot of black turbans. It doesn't mean where you are in the hierarchy, what color your turban is. Some of the most prominent clergy wear white turbans, so they're not descended from the Prophet. Both Khomeini and Khamenei, if you notice, wear black turbans. So they can claim, how legitimate the claim is, who's going to test, but they claim that they are descended, they are Sayyids, that they are of the family of the Prophet, direct descendants of generally of Hassan or Hussein. All right, and also the daughters of the Prophet, they count. So the clergy then dominates the political life of Iran. And in the West, scholars and like the New York Times person, she kept talking about the moderates and the hardliners. Iranians in exile would say that that's a meaningless distinction because all of the politics is decided by clergy. And so as long as all of it is clerical, the authority and the political authority in the country rests with the clergy, then there really are no moderates. It's clergy versus clergy. But I would argue that even with the acknowledgement that is true, that all of the political decisions in Iran are made by clerics, there still can be factions within those. And so the factions then are basically the hard-line conservatives, those people who want a very strict Islamic state. They're the ones who, after the revolution, nationalized all private businesses other than restaurants, shops. They were still in private hands, but all banks, all factories, and most hotels were taken over by the government. So economic life would be dominated by the government. There would be very little private enterprise other than shopkeepers. Shopkeepers were one of the base of the Islamic movement. The people who ran the small shops in the bazaars were very strong supporters of Khomeini. And so the religious establishment would not take over their livelihoods. But factories were taken over. Agriculture was left. There had been some reform of agriculture under the Shah, and the people who owned their farms were allowed to keep them. The problem with Iran is Iran's agriculture is, because of the country, mentioned this earlier, is so dry. The agricultural sector is not very strong in Iran. There are a few niche products, but generally speaking, Iran cannot feed itself based on what it produces. So the hardliners then are for basically a primitive economy, state-run with peasants and shopkeepers. And that's kind of how they view what is the ideal Islamic society. The moderates have favored the taking of the oil revenues and trying to develop other resources in the country so that it's not as dependent on oil as it is. And it's not as bad as Saudi Arabia. I just looked this morning, and 20% of the 20% of the government's revenue comes from oil, whereas in Saudi Arabia it's 90%. So it is not as dependent on oil as Saudi Arabia, but oil does underpin where the money is coming in Iran. I'll talk more about that when we talk about the embargo. But Iran, especially under the Shah, was very much driven by oil, and he then created some industries that were funded by the state, and some of his cronies created industries. But generally speaking, if you compare Iran to Turkey, whereas Turkey was industrializing in the 90s very heavily by private enterprise, there was no equivalent under the Shah, and then there was no until the 1990s, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, when the moderates are in power. There's no equivalent in Iran either. Okay, so the elections happen, and the parliament meets, and the Iranian government actually broadcasts the parliamentary sessions live. And so there is some political interest, and you can gauge what the people are thinking by how many they turn out. There was an election in the fall. I think it may have been for Majlis. It wasn't for president, but it may have been for the Majlis, for the parliament. But anyway, it was 30 to 40%. In the 90s, it was as high as 70 to 80%. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. That's the period when the moderates are in power. So if we look at our presidents, and that's how I'll deal with the rest of more or less the rest of the class, is that we have Ali Akbar Rafsanjani. I can't get a more Shia name than that. Ali Akbar means Ali is most great. Normally we say Allahu Akbar, but they say Ali Akbar. Ali is great. He was a cleric from an old established clerical family, but he's also very a shrewd guy. And he decides that Iran needs to, they're coming off the war with Iraq. And he thinks that Iran really needs to open up a little bit to the West in industrialization, in moderating some of the more stricter rules, Islamic rules on the population. Iran at that time had a very high birth rate. It was roughly, I think, 4 children per woman. So it's a high birth rate. So by, say, 2000, you have a whole large generation of people who were born after the Islamic Revolution, who didn't remember the Shah. And so those are the ones who the moderates are appealing to. They're appealing to the young, educated. And Iran has a pretty high standard of education. It's free. universities are free. And it also is interesting that although we think of it as an Islamic republic and therefore restrictions on women, women are the majority of students in Iranian universities. And women hold very important jobs in the Iranian economy. So they have to wear headscarves. That's mandated by law. And when you're in Iran, you kind of are struck by the fact that in the big cities, the women kind of push that headscarf law to the limits. In other words, instead of covering up their head like this, which is what the clergy wants, you see them with their scarves kind of, their hair is showing, they got a scarf up here, they're supposed to wear conservative clothing, so they wear a kind of a sacky dress, but underneath it you can see they're wearing high heels and very chic pants. So they're fighting it in the ways they have. And so there is a younger generation that has developed so that now most people in Iran were born after the revolution. And those people are the ones the moderates are appealing to. It's the urban population that is educated. There are also a lot of urban population that's very poor, because what's happened in Iran, because the agriculture hasn't really boomed and there hasn't been much investment in it, say unlike Turkey's commercial agriculture, people continue to leave. So one of the things that struck me in my trip was we went down the mountains, through the mountains of the Zagros Mountains, which is probably the richest agricultural area in Iran because of its valleys. There are all these valleys that are scattered among the mountains. And there could be intensive farming. There was almost no farming. And you drive through the villages and they look abandoned. And I asked the guides and even the minder, the guy who kind of represents the government view, he said, no, the peasants are all leaving. They don't live in the villages anymore. The only people you'll find in the villages are old people. And it looked that way. It looked very desolate. If you compared it to, say, village life in Turkey, which was very vibrant, you would say that, well, these look like, ghost villages. So people have moved into the towns, and the ones who do well, who have education, they have a relatively high standard of living and are also very skeptical of the state. The ones who are poor, which is the majority, they are still loyal to the clergy and to the state. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute, because that's the third president. He appealed to that group. So we go back to Rafsanjani, and he, as I said, economic, but he also cultural. And he appointed as his cultural minister Mohammad Khatami, who was president then from 1997 to 2005. And Khatami really kind of ushers in a golden age of Iranian cinema. I don't know if you've seen any Iranian films. They're still being made. They're often made surreptitiously, filmed secretly because of the government has cracked down on it. But in the mid-90s to 2000, say, there was a real flourishing of brilliant Iranian films. Filmmakers, both men and women. So you have they're more like European films in that you have an auteur, you have somebody who writes the film and then is the director. So that person pretty much makes his or her own film. And they're very amazing in how open they are about things that are going on in Iran. And the one thing that is, when you watch them, and one time I taught a class on Middle Eastern film, and when you watch them, you notice that there's things where they're not going to push beyond what the censors will allow. For example, you have scenes of family life, people in their houses, and the actresses are all wearing headscarves. And you would not have that in a real Iranian home, because in the home, then the male members of the family, the woman doesn't have to cover herself from the male members of her own family. So but why is she wearing a headscarf in the scene where she's very domestic? Is because the male audience will be seeing her. And so there's a bit of unreality there in that because there's a male audience in the film, in the cinema, then this actresses, even though they would not be wearing headscarves at home, will wear headscarves at home. And also then, of course, there's no kissing, and there's even no touching of hands. There's a very I think, a very important film that's, I think it's called The Thief. And it's a younger guy who gets involved with an older woman who basically uses him to rob. And he goes and robs for her, and then she pawns the stuff that he steals. But there is a scene, the movie maker wants you to understand that they're sleeping together, living together. But of course, that can't be shown on screen. So they have this scene where they go into the apartment, they take off their shoes, which in Iran and all the Middle East, people take off their shoes when they go into a house. Now, in most houses, you put it in the vestibule, you'll keep your shoes there. And in apartments I've been in Syria or in Egypt or in Turkey, they usually put them right inside the door. But in Iran, I've noticed this, that the apartments, they'll keep their shoes outside the door in the hallway. And so how the filmmaker gets across to you that they've spent the night together is, one, it shows them going into the apartment in the evening with the shoes there. Then the next morning, it's clear it's morning, the shoes are still there. So you know they've cohabitated over the night. You don't know what they did, the doors are closed, but they get so in other words, they were pushing the what they could do to its limit. And so I should have made a list of Iranian films. If you're interested, you can write me. I can give you some names of some of the better films. Maybe in your time of confinement, you'll be able to, I'm sure on some of the streaming, Netflix probably has some of them, although it's been now 20 years since the really good Iranian films were made, and I don't know whether Netflix will carry the films from that old. But if you can, like I said, if you're interested, please email me, and I will be glad to supply you with a list of some of the better Iranian films from that period. So anyway, that was Khatami. Khatami says, okay, we got to show that we are a cultivated country. And then they had the elections in 1997, and he ran for president, and there was an amazing turnout. There was just, it kind of shocked the Iranian establishment, the religious establishment, because he was overwhelmingly elected. And when they, as much as they do surveys in Iran, it was the young people that had elected him. And so in his period, and then you can see that he is president during the period of the Second American War with Iraq. And that gives a real boost to Iraq because, to Iran, because Iran, that had been their enemy. And with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and then the rise of Shia politics in Iraq, then that gives Iran a entryway into Iraq. And I think that in some ways emboldens the conservatives, if we're going to call them conservatives and moderates, or hardliners and moderates, what do we call them? It emboldens them because they then see that Khomeini's idea of mobilizing Shia forces outside of Iran, especially in the Arab countries where there are Shia populations, that could be used to Iran's advantage in world politics. And so you already had Iran involved in Lebanese politics with the rise of Hezbollah, but you also then get Iran starting to get involved in Iraqi politics during the American occupation. And I'll talk in a minute about the Quds Brigade, which is what's the main force of this. But so what happens then in the 2005 election, the hardliners limit the number of very severely limit the number of people who can run for parliament. It's to make sure that the parliament swings back toward the more hardliners. So many of the liberals who had been in the parliament, or so-called liberals, had been in the parliament, were disqualified and could not run for office, including Rafsanjani himself. He could not run. So he had been, deemed eligible to run for president, but he wasn't eligible to run for parliament because the hardliners had taken over the Council of Guardians who approved it. And so over half of the people who were going to run for election were disqualified in that election. And Ahmadinejad is elected president. Now, he is a non-cleric, and he is a populist. I probably don't remember him because you were just teenagers, or even not even teenagers when he was president. But he was quite famous because he made some really horrible statements. He was mayor of Tehran. So if you think of mayors of big cities, think of Erdogan. Erdogan had been mayor of Istanbul. Well, Ahmadinejad was mayor of Tehran. And in Tehran is divided. There's South Tehran, which is near the old city, and then south of it. And there's North Tehran, which is Tehran is on the side of a mountain. And so North Tehran goes up the side of the mountain, and toward the top of the mountain is where the Shah's palaces were. And he had like 5 palaces on a fairly big tract of parkland, and that overlooked the city. And then beyond that is actually skiing up in the top of the mountain. They have ski resort. So the city kind of spreads up toward the mountain, toward the palaces. And that area is called North Tehran, and that's where the better educated people live. It's laid out, looks like Paris, wide streets and lots of leafy trees and boutiques and coffee shops, and you go down and it's working class, basically working class slums. Well, Ahmadinejad came from those working class slums. And so he represented the kind of peasant population that had moved into the city, starting with the Shahs, but increasingly so under the Islamic Republic. And he was a firebrand. He's a populist. I don't speak Persian well enough myself to tell, but Iranian friend says he speaks terrible Persian. He spoke it with a kind of what we might call a hillbilly accent. And he was clearly uneducated. He is the one, among other things, to say there were no gay people in Iran. That's against, no, Iranians are, we're not that. That can only be Westerners. Decadent Westerners are gay people. We don't have that in our country. He also said he wanted to see Israel destroyed in his lifetime. So he is the one that starts the alarm bells ringing in the West. And this is when George W. Bush is more or less caught up in the still Iraq thing, and so the Americans aren't that interested, but the Israelis, remember Netanyahu is the prime minister there, takes Iran as his existential enemy. And Ahmadinejad plays on that. He comes to the United Nations and he denounces Israel, says Israel should be destroyed. And so it's, kind of a weird period of transitioning toward a more hardline Iran. And then that plays into the hands of hardliners in the United States about Iran, seeing Iran as a threat. And Americans had always, since the revolution, I would say Americans have had negative feelings toward Iran. But they're starting to increase in the media and in politicians during this period, in part justifiably so, because we can document that Iranian advisors are encouraging the Shia militias to attack the Americans. And so there is clear connection between Iran and the Shia militias attacking the United States troops in Iraq, because obviously Iran wants the United States to pull out of Iraq in the 2000s, because then that would give them a free hand to pretty much dominate Iraqi politics. So there's mutual tension between the countries. And that then changes with the election of Obama. And Obama gives greetings to the Iranians on their Nowruz, on their New Year's, which is unprecedented. And he kind of acts like he's willing to do an olive branch to the Iranians. And then, but the Iranians themselves, go back before Obama, because I left out a really important period. And that is in 2009, the elections where the presidents are elected for 4 years. They originally were 5 years, but then they moved it to 4. The presidents are for 4 years. The election, it was clear, although the Guardians had tried to limit the people who could run, it was clear that the people coming out in large numbers in the cities were young. And so the election took place, and they announced the election results in 8 hours. And Iran is a country of 80 million people. There are no electronic voting. They vote by ballot, paper ballots. And, everyone said, this is impossible. This is, and it showed an overwhelming returns for the re-election of Ahmadinejad. And so the intellectuals and the middle class in Iran, they said this has been stolen. I mean, to give you an example, Lebanon had elections about the same time. Lebanon, that took them 5 or 6 days to count the votes. Country of 3 million versus a country of 80 million. So, there's no question in any reasonable person's mind that whatever the votes were, that they could not have been counted in 8 hours. And so you start to have demonstrations on the streets of Iran in the 2009. And this, as some people have said, is the first Arab Spring. Arab Spring will come in 2011, so this is 2 years before the Arab Spring demonstrations. But what you see is the response of the Iranian state to it is what we'll see when I talk about the response of the Syrian state to their Arab Spring, and that is the Iranians start using snipers. They start shooting people down. They use their Basij. The Basij I have listed on the bottom. It says organized thugs. Your textbook calls them vigilantes, but they are people who are paid by the state. They're lower, definitely they come from the lower classes. They ride around on motorbikes with one guy driving and the guy behind him using a stick or weapons, and they attack demonstrators and then they speed off. And that you have lots of film of that because we have video cameras, right? Everybody has one on their phone. So those were smuggled out of Iran. And so it was clear that the government was using a great deal of force to put down the rebellion, and it's put down. And so the put down by force, and Ahmadinejad is then elected or announced to be the new re-elected as president. But in 2013, so this would be a year after Obama was elected, the government kind of loosened up again and allowed for Hassan Rouhani, who is a very well-respected scholar, and he was allowed to run, and he won. And again, he won because of the youth vote. And the youth, then Obama sees Rouhani as a possible person who they can talk to. And so, as I said, he sent the Nowruz, the Iranian New Year, which is March 20th. He sends the greetings to the people of Iran saying, it's time for talk, time to reconciliation. And so the embargo, which had been in place in Iran, had been put in place by Bush because they said the Iranians were developing nuclear weapons. They were developing nuclear power. Now, whether they were developing nuclear weapons or not, that's debated. But Ahmadinejad, much like Saddam Hussein, played up the fact that Iran would have nuclear weapons one day and that they would then destroy Israel. So there is a push in America, especially among the conservatives in America, to put stricter and stricter embargo. So by the time Obama becomes president in 2012, I'm sorry, what am I saying, 2012? 2008, sorry guys, 2008, he's reelected in 2012. Obama is willing, once Rouhani is president, he is willing to discuss with the Iranians, and you start to have then the negotiations between John Kerry and Mohammad Zarif, who is the Iranian foreign minister at this point. And Mohammad Zarif has got a PhD from Princeton. So he is very Western educated and not necessarily Western oriented, but he's willing to talk to the West. And you then get the discussions on how to lift some of the sanctions. And as I said, I was in Iran in 2016, and at that point, some of the sanctions were already lifted, and there was a great deal of optimism in Iran about that. And you could see where the sanctions had hurt. As I mentioned, Iran, although it's not dependent on oil, it's the third largest reserve, so it's a major source of funding for the government. It's the kind of the rainy day fund. If they need something, they can kind of send out the oil. But they had been greatly pushed back. Before the sanctions, they were They were extracting about 2.5 million barrels of oil a day. And after the sanctions, it dropped. It has dropped now even more because of Trump's sanctions have been increased, so that today Iran only exports about 300,000. I mean, only extracts about 300,000 barrels a day. So that's a major disruption in their oil production. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But anyway, go back to Rouhani. So we have this moment. We have basically 3 years of Obama administration coinciding with a moderate president in Iran. And that is the time when people were optimistic about some kind of a deal being done. And a deal was eventually done by the Americans in coordination with the Europeans and Russia to basically Iran would monitor, the nuclear facilities in Iran would be monitored, and then gradually the embargo would be lifted. And you could, when I was in Iran, it was obvious the impact of the embargo, because when you landed at the airport, there were all of these old American planes, commercial airliners, Boeings, that were in various stages of being deconstructed, because what happened is they weren't allowed to buy new planes. They did buy some from Europe, but those were also limited. But so what they did is they took all their old planes, and they were out on the runways, and they were just, as they needed parts, they would take apart the old airplanes and use them for the ones that were still flying. So I never felt worse about flying a commercial airline in my life than when I flew. I did 2 flights in Iran on the Iranian local airline, and I was petrified because it just looked, how are they keeping these planes in the air, kind of thing. And all the Iranians we talked to, and of course we were mindered, so we couldn't talk to a lot of Iranians, but the Iranians we talked to all were very optimistic about the embargo being lifted. And everyone will tell you who's been to Iran that the Iranians aren't anti-American. Hardly I didn't meet anyone who said anything anti-American. Now it might be that they don't want to say anything anti-American to an American, but generally speaking, the people were very friendly toward us as a group, and there were about 20 of us that were traveling together. So there was a lot of optimism, but maybe we shouldn't have been, because really the power behind the throne in Iran is Ali Khamenei, and he doesn't trust the United States, and he also then is increasingly turning to the more militant people in the Iranian military. And here I want to shift gears a little bit because I haven't mentioned them. It's important to know that the Iranian military consists of 2 groups. There's the Iranian army, which is pretty much like an army anywhere. It has chain of command, and it like you said, the head of the chain of command is Khamenei. But it's a professional army. And then there is what's known as the Revolutionary Guards. These were created by Khomeini in the 6 months after he came back to Iran, basically to crush any political opposition in the country. And they took the name, they have Revolutionary Guards, no, the Guards of the Revolutionary in Islam. Anyway, the word for guard in Persian is pastaran. And so that's the word that they're called locally by the Iranian people. So the Pastaran. The Pastaran are a smaller group. I would say, I don't know how many, maybe you could do Google CIA estimates. It's an elite part of the Iranian army, and they are intensely loyal to the supreme leader. Why? Because he doles out money and things to them. One of the nicest hotels I stayed in Iran is this old palace, not a palace, caravanserai that's been converted into a luxury hotel, very tastefully done luxury hotel in Isfahan, and it's owned by the Revolutionary Guard. So the Revolutionary Guard have a similar role in Iran's economy that, say, the People's Army does in China. That a lot of the what looks like maybe private enterprise is actually in the hands of people, generals in the Revolutionary Guard. So the Revolutionary Guard is not only part of the military structure, it's a very important part of the economic structure. And it is a very tightly controlled, tightly knit group. And among them, so the Revolutionary Guard, if you use the model of Nazi Germany, think of the Wehrmacht or the regular German army as that one is the Iranian army, and then think of the SS as the Revolutionary Guard. Well, there's a third group within the revolution, or there's a third group, but it's in the Revolutionary Guard, and that's called the Quds Brigade. And Quds, which is Quds, I have it down there for you. Quds Brigade. Quds in Arabic means Jerusalem. And so, calling it the Jerusalem Brigade kind of highlights the fact that what is the ultimate aim of the Quds Brigade? The overthrow or destruction of Israel. They would say the liberation of Jerusalem for the Muslims. So that has been a very shadowy group, and that was headed by Qasem Soleimani, and you may remember the Americans killed him with a drone strike this winter in Iraq. And his whole function was to foment trouble in the Shia areas in Iraq. He was the one who advised the pro-Iranian militias to attack the Americans. He has been very important in the formation of the popular forces in Iraq, and I'll talk more about them when we talk about ISIS. So the people that were mobilized in Iraq to fight ISIS were under his control. There was a very good expose done by New York Times last winter, which showed that almost all governmental decisions in Iraq are made after consulting him. Now he's dead, is probably his successor. And so he pulls the strings in what is Iraq, and he pulls the strings, it's been well documented, of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And he also then took an active part in the Syrian civil war, which I'll talk more about another time. But I mean, just to clue you, well, no, I'll talk about it later. But anyway, so and also Yemen. So if we go back to Khomeini's grand plan that Iran would emerge as a Shia power, that it would foment the creation of Shia-dominated states that would be basically satellites of Iran, because Iran, being having the supreme leader, would be the spokesperson of all the Shia. Now, as I mentioned in my lecture on Iraq, one of the stumbling blocks for them is that the Shia in Iraq have not all of them, have resisted to some extent that serfdom to Iran. I mean, Ali Sistani, the chief cleric, I suppose, and even Muqtada al-Sadr, who is a fiery anti-American, but he also has, his militia has been not as willing to participate, to take orders from the Iranians, and he has played up the fact that he's an Arab as opposed to Iranian. But the Quds Brigade is pushing that agenda, and that's why the Israelis have, when they periodically they bomb in Syria, usually what they're hitting are Quds Brigade targets in Syria, because the Israeli government is afraid that the Quds Brigade will establish permanent bases in Syria and then use those to attack Israel. So it is clearly an ongoing, simmering issue. I saw this morning in the New York Times that they have said, the Quds Brigade says, that any attack on Iranian ships engulfed by Americans will be met with, severe retaliation. So, and we also saw last fall that they shot rockets at the oil refinery in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. So they are a volatile group, a group that needs to be monitored, and Khamenei seems to be favoring them. So back to the Americans and the Iranian negotiations, we did get at the very end of the Obama administration in 2015, we did get an agreement signed by the Europeans, the Russians, Iranians, and the United States. And that has all been put on hold or actually revoked by President Trump. So we no longer abide by it, and we have put in stricter restrictions on the Iranians. And so since Trump has become president, the value of the Iranian, what they call our money, rial, the value of the rial has dropped 100%. It wasn't great to begin with. It was 15,000 to the dollar. and it's now over 30,000 to the dollar. And the economy has slumped terribly. About the only people who what the Americans have done under Trump is that any company that does business with Iran, their assets will be frozen in the United States. So Europeans who wanted to reopen business dealings with Iran, and were starting to do so. In fact, even Lockheed, the Iranians said that they were, I'm sorry, not like a Boeing, had said that they would buy, at the last period before Trump was inaugurated, they said they were willing to buy, I think it was 100 new jets from Boeing, because they would be allowed to do that under the new, the relaxing of the embargo. Certain things were allowed. Americans could buy Persian carpets. We could import Persian carpets. That was allowed. Pistachios, Persian pistachios. And they could buy jets. So that was all stopped by Trump. And so the Iranians have actually gone into a big recession that wasn't helped by the coronavirus epidemic. They've done very badly with that, and there is a lot of discontent in the country. I would say that some people said that the Rouhani will not be allowed to run again, and that the government will put in an even more hardliner in. And as I said in the last election for the parliament, where almost all the people who were considered moderates were debarred from running, the turnout was really low, I mean, depressingly low. And that showed that there is a real pent-up kind of anger among Iranians, middle-class Iranians, against the government, and whether that will spread to the less economically prosperous Iranians, whether they will still hold loyal to the clergy, is to be seen. And so that's something that you'll see playing out in your lifetime. I mean, in my lifetime, I'm just kind of stunned by the fact that Iran once was the bulwark of American foreign policy in the Middle East up until the Iranian Revolution. Since then, has become the kind of the boogeyman of American politics in the Middle East. It's seen as our one real enemy in the Middle East is Iran. And so that has caught me by surprise. And I think there'll be surprises for you in your lifetime of what will happen in Iran, because it is clearly it's a major country in the region, more so because of the fact that it sees itself as the Shia power. And as long as politics in the region is defined as Shia versus Sunni, then it's to their advantage. I mean, it's to Iran's advantage as the Islamic Republic to use that kind of push that kind of political divide. Although on the other hand, they are aware of the fact that most Muslims in the world are not Shia. And so you occasionally get a cleric who points out to the fact that Iran's support of the Palestinians, for example, has nothing to do with Sunni Shia, it's Muslim. And so they do try to play that, but I would say increasingly, and I'll talk more about this when we talk about in the context of the Syrian civil war, increasingly though, I think most Sunnis aren't really that swayed by that Islamic argument. They were perhaps in the days before, or the early period of the Islamic Republic, but once you start to see the sectarianism, as you see in Lebanon and in Iraq and in Yemen, I think most Sunnis aren't too swayed by the fact that there is a Muslim brotherhood with Iran. On the other hand, there is no one really strong enough to oppose them. I mean, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia sees itself as that power, but it has the resources, it has the money, but it doesn't have the military. They can buy all of the weapons they want from America, and they have huge storehouses, but they don't have everyone agrees, they really do not have an army that can use those weapons. And so they have tried to create various deals with the Egyptians and the Jordanians to try to get them to come on board with a defensive alliance against Iran. And Jordan has, because Jordan has very little resources. So Jordan, which does have, it's not a big army, but it's probably one of the most professional armies in the Arab world. It has said it would go in with an agreement with Saudi Arabia. Egypt has not. Egypt has definitely, even under Sisi, and I'll talk more about Egypt and the post-Arab Spring in that other lecture. But Egypt has refused to do so, and has actually maintained fairly decent relations with Iran. So for the Sunnis, there is no country that can mobilize a kind of a defensive arc against the Iranian plans. So what will happen, and this is, I don't predict, but I would ask you to look, if you're interested in 20 years from now, the next 20 years, see what happens in the parliamentary elections, see what happens when Khamenei dies, which can't be that far off. What's going to happen? I have had some experts that I know who have studied Iran all their life, the same way, here I am 70 and I've studied the Ottoman Empire all my life. They've studied Iran, 20th century Iran all their life. They have said all along that there will eventually be a backlash, that the Iranian people, being well educated and realizing that the Islamic Republic is not actually giving them what they want in life, that there will be a backlash. They thought it might happen in 2009, and this is where you run into problems, because you can have a democratic movement, but if you have people who are willing to use a brutal force, like you have in the Pastaran, the Revolutionary Guard, they're willing to do anything to keep in power. Then you wonder how can it change? Now, eventually, it probably will collapse. Soviet Union collapsed. We have seen that the only way for these kind of dictatorial states to survive is to transform themselves economically, as China did, or is trying to do. And that may work. But Iran, under the embargo, can't. That won't happen. And Iranian leadership is so stubborn about that. I can't see them willing to give up their nuclear power things, because they see that as, again, a protection. They argue that Israel, everyone knows that Israel has an atomic bomb. Why should Israel be the only country in the Middle East to have the atomic bomb? And so they have been developing their military technology. I think last week, they sent up it wasn't even the government, it was the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard sent up a military satellite. So there are vested interests in Iran, that's what I'm trying to argue, that are both brutal, but also in control of a lot of resources. So I don't know whether that revolutionary spirit will eventually blossom. As I said, my friends who are Iranian experts think it will, but I don't know whether they're just being optimistic. But I do know that if you walk away from this class, that Iran is a country that you should pay close attention to. I hoped I kind of outlined the factions, so you have to think it over again. You have the clergy in charge, and there's no question that they're in charge. And you have within the clergy what some people call hardliners and some people call moderates. But you have, I would call, those who are more practical and those who are less practical. I would say the more practical people tend to come from old families, old clerical families, that because the old clerical families also had a foot in the business world. And so they have more of an economic sense. I think some of the hardliners are men who come from villages where life was much more traditional. And they kind of envision a traditional Muslim society of, say, the 19th century. That's their ideal. And anything like videos, music, anything like that, Western, is just corrupting. And so there's a clash between generations. There's a clash between urban and rural. And that's played out in the clergy. So you have the clergy on the one hand, and then you have the secular Iranian society, which isn't religious. It isn't part of that clergy. What do they want? And that is the place where, there were demonstrations last fall during the election. There have been demonstrations against when the Iranians shot down a Ukrainian airplane after the killing of Qasem Soleimani by the Americans. There were demonstrations in Iran by young people saying that the government had lied to them. There were demonstrations at the initiation of the Corona-19 pandemic in Iran that the government was lying. And so there's a lot of sense among that disaffected population that the government is corrupt and lying. Now, again, will they be able to affect some change? As long as the military has especially the Revolutionary Guard, have the power that they have. And so I will leave this lecture or close this lecture, saying I wish the best for the Iranian people. I think they have an amazing culture, have an amazing country, but they really do have a problem with their state, and we'll see. So I'll leave you there on the next lecture, which is Thursday, will be on Arab Spring. And as I said, the Iranian experiment or the attempt at greater democracy in 2009 has often been seen as a kind of a dress rehearsal, especially for repression of the Arab Spring. And so that is also relatively a depressing lecture. And so at the end of this semester, we'll have 3 depressing lectures. We have Iran, we have the Arab Spring, and then the last lecture will be on the Syrian civil war. So again, I'll leave wishing you that you're staying healthy and safe, and also intellectually active. So as I said, if you're interested in trying to track down some of these Iranian movies, I'll be happy to supply you with names. Back in our library, we do have several of them. I donated them. Unfortunately, they were bought when they were still VHS, so I don't know whether they've been converted to DVDs. But I think many of them are actually available online. And so if you write me, I'll be glad to give you some titles. So until next time, I'll say goodbye.